Imagine you're in the crowd as the rope tightens around his neck. Then he's cut down before death can save him. In front of your eyes, they slice off his private parts and burn them in the fire. His belly is ripped open, intestines pulled out and shown to everyone. Finally, his body is chopped into pieces and hung on the city gates as a warning. This isn't justice. It's pure terror, and you would be forced to watch. Keep watching, because what you've just heard is only the beginning. The darkest, most disturbing punishments of Elizabethan England are still to come. Elizabethan England was a time of shining palaces, grand plays by Shakespeare, and the power of Queen Elizabeth I. But behind the beauty of gowns, music, and court life, there was another side dark, cruel, and terrifying. Justice in those days was not soft or forgiving. It was hard, cold, and designed to keep people under control. If someone broke the law, they did not just pay a fine or go to jail. Punishments were made to hurt, to shame, and to scare others into obedience. The law was a tool of fear. Even small crimes could bring painful endings. Theft, lying against the queen, or rebelling against the crown could all bring punishments so harsh that people today struggle to imagine them. The most serious crime of all was treason, betraying the queen or the kingdom. To the rulers, this was not just breaking a law. It was breaking the heart of England itself. Anyone accused of treason was seen as an enemy of the crown, and their punishment was not only about death, it was about sending a message. Courts in Elizabethan England did not care much for fairness. Trials were often quick. A person accused of a crime had little chance to defend themselves. Many times, the outcome was already decided before the trial even began. The law was not about protecting people. It was about protecting the Queen's power and showing everyone what would happen if they dared to rebel. Ordinary people lived with this fear every day. Imagine walking through the town and seeing bodies hanging as a warning, or hearing stories of people burned, whipped, or torn apart. Children grew up watching these punishments in public squares. Families lived in terror that one wrong move, one wrong word, could bring shame and death to their door. Even small crimes like stealing bread or pickpocketing were met with brutal punishment. Hands could be cut off. People could be whipped until their skin bled. Others were locked in wooden frames, called the pillory, while the crowd threw rotten food and stones at them. Punishment was not hidden behind prison walls. It was dragged into the open, where everyone could watch, smell, and remember. The message was always the same: obey or suffer. Elizabethan rulers believed that by showing the pain of one person, they could control thousands more. Fear was a weapon, sharper than any sword. In this time, justice was not about mercy. It was not about second chances. It was about power, control, and public humiliation. And at the center of it all were punishments so cruel and disturbing that even today they stand out in history. The most feared of them all was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment reserved for traitors, designed not just to kill, but to destroy body and spirit in the most gruesome way possible. This was Elizabethan justice, a world where fear ruled stronger than fairness, and punishment was a stage for the entire nation to watch. In Elizabethan England, executions were never private. They were not hidden in prisons or behind closed doors. Instead, they were brought out into the open, turned into a public event, almost like a cruel theater where death was the main performance, and the audience was everyone, men, women, and even children. Why? Because punishment was not only about ending one person's life. It was about controlling thousands of others. The rulers of England believed that if people could see the pain, the shame, and the horror with their own eyes, they would think twice before breaking the law. Fear was stronger when it was shared in the open. Public executions were staged with care. They were held in markets, town squares, or near city gates where large crowds could gather. Sometimes, word would spread for days before an execution, and people would travel miles to watch. It was a dark kind of entertainment mixed with terror. For the authorities, the bigger the crowd, the better. The more people who watched, the more powerful the warning. The purpose was clear. This is what happens to traitors. This is what happens to thieves. This is what happens to anyone who dares to defy the Queen. Each execution was a performance of power, showing that the crown was stronger than any single person. The atmosphere on execution days was heavy with tension. Some in the crowd came with excitement, eager to see something shocking. Others came with dread, dragging their children along because they believed it was important for them to learn the lesson early. Never disobey the law. The guilty person would be brought out, often in chains, sometimes beaten or half dead already. The crowd would shout, some cursing, some crying, others whispering prayers. And then the punishment would begin. Whether it was hanging, burning, or the gruesome torture of hanging, drawing, and quartering, the crowd saw every moment. They saw the body twist, heard the screams, smelled the blood and smoke. It was not only the victim who suffered. It was everyone watching. Terror sank deep into their hearts, leaving scars in their memory. But for the rulers, that was the point. Executions were not only about the condemned, they were about the living. Each act of cruelty said, if you step out of line, this will be you. It was a lesson carved in pain. Children learned obedience watching these scenes. Wives feared for their husbands. Men stayed loyal to the crown, even if they hated it, because they did not want their families to suffer the shame of public death. Society was kept in place not by fairness, but by horror. At the same time, public executions also served as a warning to enemies of the state. For foreign spies, rebels, and those accused of treason, the spectacle was a message England was ruthless. No one who betrayed the Queen would escape, and their suffering would be remembered long after their bodies were gone. This brutal theater of death created a culture of fear. It was meant to show that crime did not just bring punishment, it brought humiliation, shame, and pain for everyone to see. People could not turn away. They could not pretend it didn't happen. They had to watch, and they had to remember. In Elizabethan England, justice was never quiet. It shouted from the gallows. It burned at the stake. It screamed through the torn bodies of traitors. And all of it was meant to remind the people the Queen's power was absolute, and defiance meant death in front of your neighbors, your family, and your God. Among all the cruel punishments of Elizabethan England, none was more feared than hanging, drawing, and quartering. It was not just a punishment. It was a show of terror, a performance of pain, and a message to the entire kingdom. This was the fate of traitors, those accused of betraying the Queen, plotting against her, or standing against her crown, and it was designed not only to kill, but to destroy every trace of the person's body and dignity. Let us walk through the process, step by step, to understand just how gruesome and horrifying it was. The hanging, death stolen away. First came the hanging. The condemned man was tied with ropes and dragged through the streets on a wooden frame or a rough cart. This part alone was humiliating. The people watched, threw stones, spat, and shouted curses. By the time the prisoner reached the gallows, his body was bruised, and his spirit was already broken. At the scaffold, a rope was tied around his neck. But unlike normal hanging, this was not meant to give a quick death. The person was not left to hang until life slipped away. Instead, he was lifted or dropped just enough to choke, to gasp, to feel the panic of death. His body would twist and jerk as he fought for breath. The crowd would watch his face turn red, his eyes bulge, his chest heave desperately. And just before death could take him, he was cut down. This was cruelty in its purest form. Death was offered, then stolen away. The victim was left alive, half-conscious, barely breathing, but still aware of what was to come. The drawing, humiliation, and horror. Next came the drawing, one of the most shocking steps. While the victim still struggled to breathe, he was laid down and stripped. His clothes were torn away, and in front of the crowd, his most private parts, his genitals, were cut off. The pain was unimaginable. The victim screamed, his voice echoing across the crowd. Some onlookers cried, others gasped, but many cheered. For the authorities, this was not just about pain. It was about humiliation. To take away a man's manhood in front of his people was to strip him of pride, dignity, and identity. Worse still, those severed parts were thrown into a fire right before his eyes. He watched his own flesh burn. The message was clear. He would leave this world with nothing, not even the ability to continue his bloodline. His body and his future were both destroyed. The quartering, the breaking of the body. Then came the most horrifying step of all. The man's stomach was cut open, his belly torn wide. His insides, his intestines and other organs, were pulled out slowly, in full view of the watching crowd. Sometimes the executioner would lift them up, showing the slippery coils of flesh as the victim still breathed in agony. Imagine the terror, the unbearable pain. Every gasp, every scream, every movement burned into the memory of those watching. For the victim, each second was torture. He was alive as his body betrayed him, spilling open, his life slipping away piece by piece. This was not just killing. It was destruction. The body was treated as an object, a warning, a symbol of betrayal's price. The final step, the division of the body, at last, when life could no longer hold on, the body was cut into 4 pieces. The head was taken off, the arms, the legs, all divided. Blood ran across the scaffold, soaking the wood. What was once a man was now fragments of flesh. These parts were not buried with respect. No family was allowed to mourn. Instead, they were sent to different parts of the kingdom. Some were nailed to the gates of London, some hung from bridges, others displayed on city walls. Everyone who entered or left a town had to pass by the rotting flesh of traitors, a reminder of what disobedience could cost. The smell of decay filled the air for weeks. Birds pecked at the remains. Children saw it as they walked to school. Traitors passed by it daily. It was a living memory of fear. Why such cruelty? Why was this punishment created? Why was it allowed, even celebrated? The answer lies in power. For the rulers, treason was the worst crime. It was not just breaking a law. It was breaking loyalty to the queen, to God's chosen ruler. If someone betrayed the crown, their punishment had to be worse than death. It had to be unforgettable. By tearing apart the body, the state showed that even after life ended, traitors would have no rest, no honor, no legacy. Their families could not bury them. Their names would be cursed. Their memory would rot along with their flesh. For ordinary people, the message was clear: never, ever betray the queen. The fear of hanging, drawing, and quartering lived in their hearts. Even whispers of rebellion were dangerous. It kept people silent, obedient, and loyal. The emotional horror, for those who watched, the sight was scaring. Some fainted, some vomited, but many kept coming, again and again, because they believed it was their duty, or even because horror itself was a strange kind of attraction. The crowd could never forget the screams, the smell, the broken body, and that was the true power of this punishment. It lived in memory, it haunted dreams, it was retold in whispers. Even centuries later, we still remember it as one of the darkest acts of justice in human history. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was more than execution. It was a ritual of terror. It was a weapon of fear, sharper than any sword. It showed how far Elizabethan England would go to protect its crown, and it left behind a legacy of cruelty that the world still shudders to recall. The punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering was not just an idea. It was real. And it was used on real people. Behind every execution was a story of fear, betrayal, and cruelty. Some of these victims were guilty of plotting against the queen. Others were simply caught in the dangerous politics of their time. No matter what, their fates were the same: a slow, public death designed to terrify all who watched. Let us look at the stories of some who met this gruesome end. Thomas Howard, the noble traitor Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, was one of the most powerful men in England. He was born into nobility, trusted by the crown, and respected across the land. But power is dangerous, especially when it stirs ambition. Howard became entangled in plots to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's rival for the throne. For Elizabeth, this was more than betrayal. It was treason. The Queen's Council decided that Howard must pay the ultimate price. On the day of his execution, the crowd gathered in silence. They expected the shocking ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering. But because of his noble birth, Howard was granted a less gruesome fate. He was simply beheaded. Still, the threat of the harsher punishment hung over him until the very end. His near escape reminds us even nobles were not safe, and at any moment, the full horror of quartering could have been unleashed. William Collingbourne, the poet who mocked power, not all victims were great lords or dangerous spies. Some were ordinary men who dared to speak too boldly. William Collingburn was a writer who mocked King Richard III before Elizabeth's reign, but his story was remembered in Elizabethan times as a warning. He was accused of treason for spreading words that insulted the crown. His punishment was brutal. He was hanged until nearly dead, cut down, and then suffered the full process of drawing and quartering. Witnesses recorded his screams as his body was torn open. His entrails were pulled out, and he cried out to Jesus with his last breaths. The crowd was shaken, but the message was clear. Even words could cost a man his life in the most painful way possible. John Ballard, the Jesuit priest during Elizabeth's reign, England was divided by religion. Catholics and Protestants fought for control, and anyone suspected of plotting to return England to Catholic rule was seen as a traitor. John Ballard, a Catholic priest, became involved in the Babington plot, a conspiracy to kill Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. When the plot was discovered, Ballard was captured and sentenced to the most gruesome execution of all. Dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle, he was jeered at by the crowd. At the scaffold he prayed loudly, but mercy never came. He was hanged briefly, cut down, and his body was mutilated before the watching masses. His screams echoed as his insides were torn out and shown to the crowd. His head was later stuck on London Bridge, staring down at the people who passed by. The horror of his death sent shockwaves across England. It was not just punishment, it was theater, designed to show what happened to anyone who dared conspire against the Queen. Anthony Babington, the young conspirator. Anthony Babington was only a young man when he joined the plot against Elizabeth. Full of passion and loyalty to Mary, Queen of Scots, he believed he was fighting for a holy cause. But his dreams turned into a nightmare when the plot was uncovered. At his trial, he was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. On the day of execution, he walked with trembling steps, surrounded by soldiers. The crowd gathered, eager yet horrified to see what would happen. Babington was hanged until he nearly lost consciousness. Then, as he gasped for air, he was cut down. The executioner began the brutal task of disemboweling him while he was still alive. Witnesses described the sight as unbearable. His body was ripped open, his screams silenced only when death finally claimed him. The crowd, though used to such punishments, could not hold back their shock. Some turned away, some cried, but all left with the memory burned into their minds. The public memory of victims each of these executions was meant to do more than kill. It was meant to stain the names of the victims forever. Their bodies were scattered, their heads displayed, their blood left on the scaffold. Families were denied proper burials, forced to live with the shame of treason. And yet, the suffering of these men also left another mark. The people who watched carried the memories in their hearts. They spoke of the screams, the blood, the cruelty. Some whispered that the punishments were too harsh, too inhuman, even for traitors. But fear kept them silent in public. The human cost, what makes these stories so powerful is not just the violence, it is the human cost. John Ballard was a priest who believed he was serving God. Anthony Babington was a young man swept up in dreams of loyalty. William Collingburn was a poet who used his pen instead of a sword. Each of them, no matter their crime, ended their life in pain too great to describe fully. Their families wept, their friends lived in fear, and society itself was scarred by the endless cycle of public horror. Conclusion: these case studies remind us that behind every execution was a person with hopes, fears, and families. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was not just a punishment, it was a destruction of body and soul. The victims became symbols of terror, their broken forms teaching the living to obey. And yet, even in death, their suffering speaks across the centuries, showing us the dark heart of Elizabethan justice. Punishments in Elizabethan England were never private. They were staged in the open, in front of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. Families, neighbors, and strangers stood side by side, forced to watch the slow suffering of those condemned. And while the punishments were aimed at the guilty, they left deep scars on everyone who witnessed them. The family's pain for the families of those condemned. The punishment was a nightmare beyond words. Imagine a wife watching her husband dragged through the streets, mocked and beaten before a jeering crowd. She could not hold his hand, could not comfort him, could not stop the blows. All she could do was watch as the man she loved was humiliated, tortured, and torn apart. Children, too, often saw their fathers executed. They stood in the crowd, clutching their mother's hand, trembling as they heard the screams of the person they loved most in the world. For the rest of their lives, those children carried the memory of that horror. Many grew up in silence and fear, haunted by images they could never forget. Families were not only robbed of their loved ones, they were robbed of dignity. They were denied burials, denied the chance to say goodbye, denied even the smallest comfort of a grave to mourn over. Instead, they had to live with the sight of their father's or husband's head on a city gate, rotting under the sun, seen by every passerby. This was punishment not just for the condemned, but for those left behind. The crown wanted families to suffer too, so that no one would dare follow in the traitor's footsteps. The crowd's reactions for the public executions were complex. Some came with excitement, treating the event like a spectacle. They cheered when the rope tightened, when the knife struck, when the body was torn apart. To them it was justice. To them it was entertainment. But not everyone felt that way. Many in the crowd came with dread in their hearts. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They watched in silence, their stomachs tight, their hands shaking, as they witnessed the cruelty of their own rulers. Some fainted, others wept. Some turned away, unable to bear the sight, but still forced to hear the screams. And yet, no one could leave without feeling the weight of the message. This could happen to you. The fear was thick, pressing down on the crowd like a heavy blanket. People went home shaken, whispering prayers that they would never fall into the same fate. Trauma and silence, the emotional damage of these public punishments spread far beyond the scaffold. Families lived in shame, their names stained forever by the crime of their loved one. Neighbors avoided them, fearing guilt by association. Children grew up without fathers, haunted by images of blood and pain. The crowd, too, carried trauma. They replayed the screams in their minds, remembered the smell of burning flesh, and dreamed of the broken faces of the condemned. Fear became a permanent shadow in their lives. But silence was forced. No one could openly speak against the cruelty, not without risking their own life. So the pain was buried deep. The fear was hidden in whispers, in the shivers of children at night, in the quiet tears of mothers left alone. Fascination with horror, and yet, there was also a strange fascination. Some people could not stay away from executions. They came again and again, drawn by the shock, the spectacle, the raw reminder of life and death. In a world with little entertainment, public executions became a grim theater, mixing horror and curiosity. This fascination made the punishment even more powerful. It was not only a warning, it became a part of culture, a part of daily life. Death was not hidden, it was displayed, remembered, and retold. Empathy and shock even today. When we read about these punishments, we feel shock and sorrow. But imagine standing there in the crowd, watching it unfold before your eyes. Imagine being the child whose father's body is torn apart. Imagine being the wife who cannot cry out for mercy. Imagine being the ordinary man who sees the face of a neighbor twisted in agony. The emotional weight was unbearable. And that was the point. Elizabethan justice wanted people not only to see the cruelty, but to feel it, to carry it in their hearts, to live with fear. Conclusion: public executions were more than punishments. They were weapons, used not just to kill but to wound families, to scar communities, to teach obedience through horror. For the condemned, death came slowly. For their families and the public, the trauma never ended. The cruelty lived on in memories, in silence, and in fear, a reminder that in Elizabethan England, justice was not about fairness, but about power carved in blood. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was the most famous punishment in Elizabethan England, but sadly, it was not the only one. The time of Queen Elizabeth was filled with cruel and painful ways to punish people. The goal was always the same: to scare everyone, to control the people, and to make an example out of anyone who disobeyed. Let's look at some of the other punishments, and you will see how horrifying life could be. Burning at the stake, one of the most terrifying punishments was being burned alive at the stake. Imagine a person tied tightly to a wooden post, surrounded by dry sticks and hay. The crowd gathers watching with wide eyes. The fire is lit, and slowly the flames rise. The heat is unbearable, and the screams of the victim fill the air. Sometimes the fire burned slowly, making death last longer. Sometimes wet wood was used, so it smoked first, choking the person before the flames consumed them. This was often used for people accused of heresy, or those who went against the church. The thought of being burned alive made people obey without question. Families who watched their loved ones burn never forgot the smell, the screams, or the horror. Pressing, crushing to death. Another cruel method was pressing, also known as peine forte dure. This was used when someone refused to plead guilty or not guilty in court. Instead of giving them mercy, the authorities would lay the person on the ground and place a wooden board or door over their body. Then heavy stones or weights were added, one by one, crushing them slowly. The chest would cave in, ribs would break, and the victim would gasp for breath until finally death came. Sometimes this took hours, sometimes even days. The slow suffering was meant to break the spirit of anyone who dared to resist the law. The pillory and whipping, not all punishments ended in death, but even those could leave deep scars. The pillory was a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands. The person would be locked in place in a public square, unable to move. Crowds gathered not to show pity, but to mock and humiliate. People threw rotten food, stones, and sometimes even filth at the prisoner. Whipping was often added to this shame. The victim's back was stripped bare and beaten until the skin tore open and blood ran down. Though they might survive, the pain, the scars, and the public humiliation stayed for life. It was a way of destroying a person's dignity, even if their body survived. Comparing to hanging, drawing, and quartering, these punishments were all cruel, but hanging, drawing, and quartering still stood apart in its horror. Burning was painful, pressing was crushing, and whipping left scars, but the step-by-step torture of being hanged, cut open, and torn into pieces was unmatched in brutality. It was the crown's way of showing ultimate power. It told people, if you betray the queen, this is your fate. Still, the other punishments remind us that cruelty was not rare. It was part of daily life. The world of fear, every punishment in Elizabethan England carried a message: obey or suffer. For ordinary people, just knowing these punishments existed was enough to keep them silent. Parents warned their children. Neighbors whispered in fear. Justice was not about fairness, it was about control. To live in such a time was to carry fear in your heart every day, knowing that even a small mistake could end in fire, chains, or death. In Elizabethan England, punishments were not just about hurting the body, they were about shaping the mind. Fear was the most powerful weapon the rulers had, and they used it with care. Public executions and cruel tortures were not only done to punish a single person, they were designed to send a message to everyone else. The message was clear: this could be you. A fear as a tool of control. Imagine being a common villager, walking through the town square. You pass by the city gates, and there you see the head of a man once accused of treason, stuck on a spike. His face, once alive, now rotting, is a warning to all. You would not dare whisper against the queen. You would not dare even think of rebelling. Fear controlled the people better than any army could. It kept them silent. It kept them obedient. The authorities knew that terror worked. By making punishments gruesome and public, they reached deep into people's hearts. Even if you never broke the law, you carried the image of screaming victims, the smell of burning flesh, or the sight of broken bodies. These memories stayed forever, making sure you never forgot the power of the crown, the behavior of ordinary people. Because of this constant fear, people lived differently. Many avoided speaking their true thoughts. Neighbors spied on one another, afraid of being linked to rebellion. Even families were cautious. A careless word at the dinner table could one day lead to an accusation. Children grew up watching these spectacles, their minds shaped by violence. Instead of learning mercy, they learned silence. Instead of believing in justice, they believed in survival. Some people even pretended to cheer during executions. They forced themselves to laugh or clap just to hide their terror. Showing sadness could make others suspicious. Why do you pity a traitor? And suspicion was dangerous. In this way, fear twisted human behavior, turning compassion into a risk and obedience into the only safe path. Emotional toll, despair, and trauma, the psychological damage was deep. Families who lost loved ones were left not only with grief, but with shame. A father executed for treason left behind children who would forever carry the label of traitor's kin. They were marked by society, avoided, and humiliated. Mothers wept silently, not only for the death but for the dishonor. The public also carried silent wounds. Watching death again and again hardened some people, but it broke others. The screams of victims echoed in minds at night, haunting dreams. The smell of burning flesh or the sight of bodies torn apart could not be forgotten. Fear did not only control, it crushed the human spirit. A society built on terror. Elizabethan England was, in many ways, a society built on terror. Justice was not about fairness, it was about survival. The punishments shaped the way people spoke, behaved, and even thought. It made people careful with their words, loyal to authority, and obedient to power. But it also left scars, emotional, mental, and spiritual, that would last for generations. Living under such a system meant that hope was small, and despair was large. It meant that life was lived in the shadow of the scaffold and the fire, and it meant that ordinary people carried the burden of fear every single day. The punishments of Elizabethan England are remembered today not because they were fair or just, but because they were so extreme, so horrifying, that they left a mark on human memory. History keeps these stories alive to remind us of the dark paths justice once walked. Why these punishments became famous. The brutality was unforgettable. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was not simply death. It was a public theater of pain, designed to shock. Burning, pressing, whipping, all of these punishments burned themselves into the minds of those who saw them and into the records that survived. Historians, writers, and even ordinary people kept these memories alive because they represented the raw power of fear. We remember them today because they show us the extreme lengths rulers once went to in order to control their people. Lessons about cruelty and power. Looking back, these punishments tell us a clear lesson: cruelty may control, but it does not create true loyalty. The rulers of Elizabethan England used fear to hold society together, but at the cost of human dignity. People obeyed, yes, but they obeyed out of terror, not respect. This reminds us how dangerous it is when justice becomes cruelty. When law is used not to protect but to humiliate and destroy, society itself suffers. Human morality and reflection. For us today, there is a strange mix of emotions when we learn about these punishments. On one hand, we feel horror. How could people do such things to one another? On the other, we feel curiosity. Why was this considered normal? This mix is what makes history powerful. It forces us to reflect on human morality. It shows us that cruelty, once accepted as justice, can later be seen as barbaric. These punishments are remembered so we never forget the danger of losing compassion. They are warnings from the past, whispers of pain carried through time, urging us not to repeat the same mistakes. The weight of memory in the end. The reason we still talk about these punishments is simple: they shock us, and they teach us. They show the darkest side of human history, where suffering was used as control, but they also show how far we have come and how important it is to keep justice tied to humanity. Elizabethan punishments remain famous because they remind us of fear, cruelty, and the cost of power, but most importantly, they remind us that justice must never again be confused with terror. When we look back at the punishments of Elizabethan England, they feel like stories from another world, so brutal, so merciless, that it is hard to believe people once accepted them as normal. Yet these punishments are not just relics of history, they are part of the long journey that led us to the systems of justice we have today. From cruelty to change. As time passed, society began to question the need for such cruelty. People slowly realized that terror might force obedience, but it did not build trust or fairness. Public executions began to lose their power as crowds grew sickened rather than inspired. Over the centuries, voices rose demanding more humane systems, punishments that corrected rather than destroyed, laws that protected rather than terrified. Step by step, the world moved away from the scaffold, the fire, and the whip. A new idea of justice. Modern justice is not perfect, but it is built on a very different foundation. Today, we punish crimes through courts, trials, and prisons. The goal is no longer to humiliate or torture, but to seek balance between punishment and fairness. Instead of using fear to control people, societies now aim, at least in principle, to use law to protect them. This change marks one of humanity's greatest achievements, the shift from cruelty to compassion, from terror to order. Why the past still matters. Still, we must not forget the past. Remembering Elizabethan punishments keeps us aware of how easily justice can be twisted into cruelty. It reminds us that fear was once considered a normal tool of power, and that people, ordinary men, women, and even children, suffered under it. History serves as a warning. If compassion is lost, justice can once again become a weapon of pain, relief, and progress. There is relief in knowing we no longer live under such punishments. No one today has to fear being burned alive for belief or torn apart for treason. We live in a world where, despite flaws, justice seeks to respect human dignity. That progress should not be taken for granted. It is the legacy of centuries of change, of people daring to believe in fairness over fear. In the end, the punishments of Elizabethan England stand as both a shadow and a lesson. They show us where we once were, and they remind us to keep moving forward. The world may never fully escape cruelty, but by remembering history, we can make sure it is never again mistaken for justice. Looking back at Elizabethan England, it is clear why this period is remembered with both fascination and horror. The punishments were not simply about law and order, they were about fear, control, and public spectacle. Hanging, drawing, and quartering remains the most shocking of them all, a punishment so gruesome that even describing it feels unbearable. A man hanged but cut down before death, his body violated, his insides torn out, and his remains scattered for all to see. It was cruelty turned into theater, designed to make every witness tremble. But it was not the only horror. Burning at the stake turned human beings into living torches, pressing crushed bodies slowly beneath the weight of stones. The pillory and whipping humiliated and scarred people, leaving their dignity stripped away. Each punishment, in its own way, left marks not just on the victims, but on the society that watched. Families carried trauma, children grew up in fear, and entire towns learned obedience through terror. The emotional impact is difficult to ignore. Imagine standing in a crowd, hearing the screams, smelling the fire, watching a body broken before your eyes. People clapped, cheered, or jeered not because they wanted to, but because fear demanded it. Compassion became dangerous, silence became survival, and justice became cruelty. Today, we remember these punishments not to glorify them, but to understand them. They remind us of how far human justice has come, and how fragile compassion can be. They force us to face an uncomfortable truth. History is not always noble. Sometimes it is brutal, bloody, and shameful, and that is the final lesson. The past warns us that cruelty can be accepted when fear rules. It shows us that power, unchecked by mercy, can turn justice into torture. These punishments must be remembered, because forgetting them risks repeating them in new forms. As we close this journey through Elizabethan punishments, one truth remains: history is a mirror. It reflects the darkest corners of humanity, but it also challenges us to choose a different path. Let us never allow cruelty to wear the mask of justice again.